I'll try to keep this conversation very packed with practical advice and specific examples that you can start implementing in your planning process right away. We have two wonderful women with great background in program management joining us today. So first, I'll introduce Becky Flint. She's the CEO and founder of Dragonboat, which is a PPM platform for outcome-driven product organizations. Becky built product portfolio management and led quarterly planning at PayPal, Shutterfly, BigCommerce, and Feedzai, and has partnered closely with both product, business, and technology leaders. Becky started Dragonboat from her firsthand learning to streamline and automate product portfolio planning, tracking, and reporting. Pam, I won't try to say your last name. What is it? You tell me.
Surjadjaja.
Surjadjaja. Okay, there we go. So Pam is the head of TPM for LinkedIn Marketing Solutions. She leads a team of TPMs that drives planning, engineering ops, portfolio, and program management. And she led planning and programs at LinkedIn, Fitbit, and PayPal, and was also a Deloitte consultant. Okay, so I'm going to talk the challenges quickly, just to kind of establish the framework and the context of which the conversation will evolve today, and then pass it over to the speakers who will spend the majority of the time having a conversation back and forth. So when we're looking at the primary challenges of quarterly planning, it kind of falls into these buckets that revolve around these questions. So who gets the resources? Where are we stuck? How do we all get on the same page? What if things change? How do we change along with it? And then is it working? So with that, a lot to cover today. If you have questions throughout, please feel free to submit them through the chat, and then we'll make sure they're covered during the conversation or when we end. So over to you two.
Hey, thanks, Baji, and great to have this chat with you again, Pam. We had this chat sometime last year, and it was very well received and lots of follow-up questions from there. So we just bring it back a little bit, and then we dive into the more details. So I think one of the things that actually people came to us a lot to ask us to say, hey, what is your career journey? Would love to hear from you, Pam. You've done quite a bit in your career. Tell us a little bit of your journey and how you, from a program manager and from Deloitte consultant all the way to leading a program management team.
Yeah, so I can share a little bit. So I started my career very much in the program management, kind of like program and product management, more like a business analyst position in Deloitte Consulting. I was actually part of Deloitte Digital. So we do implementation, but also strategy consulting for high tech and actually a bunch of industry, including like medical and biotech industry. So from there, I actually transitioned, sometimes from a consultant, you can actually go into many different kind of career routes. But I think what really stuck with me was program management. I was really good at it, but also it was a way to kind of people to see things holistically as to what is happening in the company. And I thought that would be a place where I could, both exercise my muscle, but also help. That was an area where I was really curious about. So I moved into PayPal. I joined as an IC. I started out my career as a program manager. I led a platform team, and then from there, I started being more towards the UI teams. So that's how PayPal was kind of structured at that point of time. And then I was basically, from there, I transitioned into Fitbit, which was a little bit different because it deals with hardware and software because it's consumer products. Also very curious into the space. As you see, like every career move was more of like, I'm curious, I want to grow my skills. I actually joined there as a portfolio program managers. They had Scrum Masters, but I was actually not dealing with Scrum Master stuff. I became portfolio program manager, and we established the portfolio management office at Fitbit. And Fitbit was actually following the SAFe Agile. So if you guys are familiar with that, it's more of like very controlled, very structured, and large scale like release planning. And then from there, I transitioned to LinkedIn. I transitioned as an IC, but I quickly grew into management. A lot of the skills throughout my career, especially around planning, kind of helped build on top of each other and help me to understand the different varieties of planning out there. So that's pretty much, long story short, that's my journey.
Yeah, awesome. So cool. And I really love the fact that you use and leverage your experience in from a business analyst, which has both the product and execution, like program management elements, and it really molded into, similarly, my career has also been from, sort of the product and tech execution, and it grow into, the program leaders to ultimately become executive. In that, planning actually play a very big role in that how you tie these moving pieces of the business goals and customer needs and product initiatives with your resources and stakeholders, and then put that all together. It's funny, you think about it, it's actually more like a CEO more than running individual projects at the execution level. So it's a really good segue to come into talking this topic, which is most companies today, well, hopefully, will complement that agile sprint activities with the quarterly planning. And that is something where previously it was like a 3-year, 1-year long planning in a waterfall era down to the 1-year quarterly planning. That's just really nice cadence with the sprints. Would I love to hear your thoughts on, it's a necessary evil, but needs to be done. So share with us some good experiences or examples of process on quarterly planning that works really well. You've done many of those.
Yeah, so quarterly planning, I would see that it's multiple stages towards quarterly planning, right? There's, of course, the team level, there is then like the org level, and then there's an executive level. So depending on which company, you call it kind of differently. So like at LinkedIn, we call QBRs, which are kind of like the bigger kind of like, okay, what did you do before? Where are you heading? And then some kind of insights from executive. And at the org level, really more of like, okay, this quarter, what are we solidifying to what we are delivering? For us, we define it as OKRs. So there is interconnection throughout the whole thing. I think what is really has been like the good experience is that when people leverage quarterly planning to really more of like align on like executive decisions, I think that is the most effective way to leverage. And then of course, like at the lower level, kind of like making sure that you're already pre-aligned before you come in. You're making sure that, you're coming to quarterly planning really to more of like, I want to validate this is what I'm doing. Do you have any input or information that I'm not aware of that I may need to adjust? But a lot of the known stuff should already pre-align. And I think those are out of all the quarterly plannings I've been at, the most effective ones are the ones that does like shadow negotiation or pre-planning before we go into quarterly planning. So everybody in the room is already kind of aware. It's just like, okay, here's a snapshot of where things are. And of course, all of this kind of cascades from, like what Becky was mentioning, that's previously there's like 3-year, 1-year, there is still more like it's extremely valuable to have like a 1-year, like long-term view of what you're thinking of for this year. What's your theme, right, for this year? And really more quarterly planning will be more effective if it's more of like, okay, it's a high fidelity snapshot of what we're committing for the next 3 months. So that's right. Like a good experience. Yeah, would love to hear your thoughts, Becky.
Yeah, I think it's actually in some ways very similar in that I would take the bigger framework saying every company you have the executive level and then sort of the manager director level and then you have the team level. And to your point that if we do at the executive level, you have a high level alignment on annually or annual or whatever horizon relevant to you. If you're a startup company, maybe like 6 months or even smaller, but in the size of our audience we have today, annual is probably good, saying here's what we want to achieve year out, and here are different strategic themes or goals. And then quarterly planning, when it goes to the managers and director level, it became something where you set up quote unquote milestones or things that lead us to this annual goal, right? And the OKRs is the example you mentioned. And then obviously once you've done good quarterly planning, and that can cascade down to your team for execution and agile and the scrum level, it will be very smooth. Otherwise, it's just chaotic if you don't do this quarterly alignment well, where the bottlenecks and things are not identified, then goes down there is having a lot of problem. And I also would echo with what you said earlier about the doing the homework. And in many ways, also rely on our product partners. It's interesting, I just had a session earlier talking about quarterly planning with the product. And then from a product perspective, it's a continuous process, but it's also coming in together, meaning product managers continuously carry in their research and their market, customer feedback, and all that stuff in their system, so that they can, at almost a quarterly cadence, they would say, hey, here's how we align what our product thoughts with our OKRs and goals, so that once we go into the quarterly planning event or the sprint, whatever you call it, it's kind of pre-aligned, already have product ideas, product initiatives aligned to the quarterly goals, that is already aligned to the company vision or direction or theme, so that it's a much easier to talk across teams, right? It's sort of like what I'm hearing from you as well.
Yeah. And a lot of times I think like what we use the term is continuous planning. So planning should not only start in the first month of the, preparing for the next quarter, but you should have an idea of where you want to go. And it's kind of like a roadmap, and it's just literally like, okay, what's this next 3 months, a snapshot? You should ideally have a continuous plan, right? And roadmap where you can kind of see a longer term. And that's also how you kind of pre-align. I think where I've seen really successful teams is them pre-aligning dependencies far ahead as well. Like coming in and saying like, in 6 months, I anticipate to do this. Can we pre-align? Maybe you need to do the dependency in Q2 for us to be done in Q3, right? So there's a longer line of sight than just like within that 3 months.
Right, totally. Because our work does not start at the first of the month, of the first day of the quarter, right? It's continuously moving. So it totally makes sense that having a way to continuously monitor and thinking ahead, and then coming together on a quarterly basis, that makes a lot of sense to us as well. Now, I know that during not just quarterly planning, just plan and deliver a portfolio involve a lot of stakeholders. And what are your experiences from a primary program manager point of view on engaging with different stakeholders, and how your product team play this role together in the quarterly planning process?
Yeah, so typically I would say the core team that is really involved in quarterly planning, then I would say like there is other partner teams that you should be engaging, right? So the core teams that I know as part of quarterly planning is always kind of like the engineering lead, and then sometimes you have both engineering manager and tech lead. Or if you're doing certain projects, you'll be including the tech leads for each area. And then you have, of course, the product manager, right? So 3 of you, and then plus design is usually very much involved in the quarterly planning. Beyond that, other stakeholders that has been extremely valuable is PMM, so product marketing, as well as BD. So depending on the stages of where you are in terms of your product experiences and what you're trying to roll out, if you're trying to go to market during that period of time, then you want to make sure you're informing your product marketing folks, because sometimes that may shift some of your plans for the quarter, right? And then there is also kind of like, depending on where you are again, like regional partners or other partners that you have in the company. And then BD as well, just to inform what is the pipeline coming in potentially that you want to partner with folks. So those are kind of like the folks that we usually work with. At the end of the day, people that are accountable really for the quarterly planning is product, program engineering, and design, depending on the stage of the projects that you're executing on as well.
Yeah, I think you actually made a very good call out. I want to just double click on that as well, because, like you said, a product manager, product program, and edge lead, maybe design sometimes, are fairly involved in the quarterly planning, or in some ways continuous planning, right? So we continue to think about what we could do, what we should do, and what other things can be evaluated. One of the key things that a lot of people are trying to figure out is, so what is the product manager's role? What is the program manager's role in this process? And I will share a little bit my experience. What I'd like to hear from yours as well is that product managers, especially when the company gets bigger, the scope become a more broader, so that the specialty would involved more so than before. When the company is small, maybe they don't even have program manager. Product manager does both. When the company gets bigger, to the extent we start to have program manager, product manager, 2 different roles, then there is a little bit of separation of what, who covers what. And program manager in my experience, being mostly focused on in this case is like a cross-functional collaboration, cross-functional stakeholder involvement, and then also play somewhat of a high-level schedule time magic in that sometimes something is really urgent, it's a really high priority, but it's not ready to start because there are dependencies or whatever, or they have a longer deadline. So then program manager can help in the process, not only involve, like you mentioned, the BDs and PMMs to make sure the timelines is lined up in an optimal way, that would also help product to slot different pieces in the best way possible, so that the most important things don't necessarily need to be done first, because sometimes you finish, you wait, where you can finish other stuff, you have plenty of time to work on other things, and it's still being able to hit the date for PRs, for BDs, and so on and so forth. So that's my kind of very high level some experience on how program manager can create magic in, take not just the help and then lead the quarterly planning, but really change the outcome, because we can add the time and dependency execution elements to the product priorities and the strategies. So that's my experience. So how does it work in your experience?
Yeah, so it's very much similar. Also, I see product manager and program manager roles evolve with the size of the company. So in a smaller company, product and program manager tend to be I think smaller companies tend to be very tightly knitted, right? Where it's like, okay, let's think about a strategy together. Let's kind of figure out what the execution may be, divide, conquer. Like there's some overlaps in terms of both skills and kind of like function. But as you grow bigger, what I've noticed is that product usually focus a lot more on the strategy side of the house. So the longer view and kind of like I would say, marketing of the project, or the kind of like pitching of the project or pitching of the idea to people. And that's usually where they spend a lot of their time, because it takes a lot of time. And that's where they hand off to program managers to kind of help with everything else. So once there is the alignment on the top, then it's more of the understanding, okay, how do we operate this, right? What is the operating plan? How do we execute this? How do we align this so that there is less disruption during handoff, especially with multiple teams? And that's where program managers really, I would say, does the magic, right? For like a better word, like does the magic to kind of help make sure that everything is aligned. Also kind of like, here are the places where there will be handoff and how do we do the handoff? So they are really responsible for like the operating plan, executing it, up till with even, I would say, having that discussion with PMMs, with BD to align everything to go to market. So I've seen I've seen program managers does different kind of roles. So some program managers would actually help till the end of the life cycle,
right?
Meaning like all the way delivery to the customer, feedback, and then looping it back. I've seen program managers in the capacity of just like, okay, up to the point where we're delivering to go to market, GA, feedback and everything, like PM kind of work with that with people that are like, in the sales organization or in other organizations possibly. So I've seen it done different ways, but definitely for sure, I think like for program managers in the quarterly planning, it's like it helps to kind of identify how should we structure the delivery, and at what point are there handoffs, and when in the quarter, or is it future quarters where the handoff should happen?
Right. I think that's totally true. I think two things are calling out is that one is obviously there's the skill sets and the interest and the focus of the individual varies, but in many ways, the program manager adds the most value is to actually take the program further out to the end, so that more than just working with the Scrum team, that will be end of it. I think in many cases, the program manager, especially the more strategic program management, actually take it all the way to the end. So take it to the end of the customer or even feedback. And I think that would add a lot of value to drive the continuous and then with the context and planning. So the second part you mentioned, I think it's very important, is the timing, the execution, because nobody will think about the execution and timing as sequence and the portfolio or / program plan, even though they're not like a waterfall. You do not like plan everything to the dates, but you do have to put an aspiration of how things look, and that's achievable by engineering resource and dependencies, right? So that if you don't have the element, that plan just won't come into place. The quarter will just fall apart. So with that said, I'm actually gonna just move to the next topic related, which is around multiple teams and multiple resources. And that's something that as program managers deal with a lot, where you have other teams come to our team asking for resources. Within our own, a couple of teams, we also have to deal with the dependencies and the bottlenecks. How do you go about help manage this decision making?
Yeah. So with multiple products, I've seen like the way program managers could be really effective is when you're going in and helping bridge everything together, where you're looking at this more from a program's perspective instead of my team and your team, right? So I think where it really has, so how planning in multiple product teams have happened, and I think has been extremely successful, is that, put aside like the actual planning like thing itself, right? But first, actually coming together as a kickoff of like, okay, here are all the teams that are needed. Here's our vision. This is where we want to go. We've aligned, and hopefully by then, like you've already aligned on the top that this is like a initiative that everybody is supposed to be doing, right? Or will be doing or spending some time on it. And then bring people all together just with the why, right? Like, why are we doing this? What are we doing? And then from there, really kind of like asking them, what do you need to do? And then some of these, what you need to do has already pre-discussed before you even do the kickoff meeting. So you kind of know roughly, okay, this is what people need to be doing in their area. And then so you give them the opportunity for them to actually pre-plan, right? Or plan it. And then give them a week or two, come back together and say, what does it look in terms of timeline? And then from there, that's where you actually really talk about sequencing and dependencies. It's like, okay, you need to go first, or I need to go first. Can we adjust? What can drop? Like what can be slotted where, right? So there's a lot of times people think that, oh, in the traditional way, it's like you have this chunk of work that you need to do. We can only come and start integrating in the middle of it or like after it, right? But there are some creative ways that you can definitely do where you don't have to wait for this whole chunk of work to be done, tested, everything, where you can start integrating depending on what the thing is. So that's where that discussion is. So you kind of do it more with like you're planning together. So you're not necessarily just planning in silos. Because I think it becomes really dangerous when you're planning in silos, because then you don't have any input on kind of like whether you're in the right direction or not. And when you come together, it will actually become much more messier than if you're like, hey, let's plan together and figure out how this is gonna happen, basically.
Right.
Or can we think about creative ways? Yeah.
Right. Totally makes sense. And I think that there was a funny thing we called in the past. We called it Agile Madness, because in the earlier days when a team start to adopt Agile, they think, hey, we have a self-organized team, we have everything managed here, and we have product management, engineering, we can deal with anything. But then very quickly you realize when the company started to have 3-4 teams, that won't work, because one team relying the others and so forth. So then everyone's running around trying to align things at the Scrum level, just fall apart. And when you have, so the planning in silos, it's exactly the causing that problem of the Agile Madness. So that when we do quarterly planning at the portfolio level, then we can understand the dependencies in both the product functionalities. People tend to think about dependency at product functionality, but really also from a resourcing perspective. Like you said earlier, if one team require multiple team, it's important to highlight. I can almost think about a spreadsheets, or in the term of Dragonboat, it's like you have a list of product features that require team A, B, C at different efforts. So that when you plan it, you can already account for to say if team A is oversubscribed with all the things coming to them, then the other teams can commit, but this team A will become a bottleneck. You were stuck. So let's solve that problem now collaboratively by taking the understanding of efforts and the resourcing needs of my team along with all the other teams' needs in one place. So you can see your projects or initiatives, and you can see the resourcing needs of different teams. So that's like the cross-team dependency in addition to the feature level dependency. So when you add these two together and plan collaboratively, it will give you the, at least the highlight the easily identifiable bottlenecks and get them addressed before go to the execution.
Yeah, and I have to echo that and like really double click on the importance of like planning together, because that's where you actually be able to have the collective minds to brainstorm, right? Sometimes like maybe team A is like, yeah, I can do it. I don't have the resources. And like there might be other creative ways that may not need to stretch certain resources, right? Could we do it here? Could we do it there? Is that, feasible? Or do you need our help to kind of advocate this to your leadership? Or is there something that we can help you to kind of help move things around, right? What is it? What help could we help you with? And then also what Becky was mentioning around like planning at portfolio level, that makes it much more easier when things are aligned at the top, especially for large initiatives that has like maybe 10 dependencies. In some cases for like projects that I've ran, they have like been 100 stakeholders, right? So how do you manage all of that? So there's definitely a lot of the buy-ins, the pre kind of like stuff that needs to happen before you actually talk about timeline or actually locking down any plan.
Right. And I think that, you mentioned something where a lot of people who are in program manager role today, they may or may not realize that the program manager role is still defined in the older era. In the old days, people would think about program managers as someone manage a basket of projects. But in reality, with the Agile coming, the typical project manager that defined as the PMI, the project management, it's no longer really that common anymore, especially in software, right? So the program managers role also have really evolved into portfolio manager, because you manage a lot more teams, a lot more fluid. There's a lot of resource allocation and then reallocation across multiple product areas, and you need to make an adjustment there. So I think, to your point, that for a quarterly planning and then, both for your team across multiple teams to be successful, you have to take a portfolio mindset.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to go down to talk a little bit about politics and, existing every company, big and small, that's fine. But I think we program managers, because we interact with so many stakeholders and so many different places, and in many ways, politics, it's not because people have a bad intention. It's just something that they see more closely. They feel this is more important than the others, and other people have a different perspective. So then all of a sudden you start to have a different perspective. There's a politics happening, and then someone wants to work on certain areas, the pet projects, and some other areas. So how did you deal with this? I think politics started happening maybe 10 people, 20 people company, and that gets more complicated when you get hit 100, right? So how do you handle undercurrents and politics and pet projects during planning and throughout?
Yeah, so during planning specifically, I think, there's one thing to always take note is like make sure that you are actually evaluating every project. And especially if somebody's dependent on you, right? For example, and you have a lot of people dependent on you. How do you measure and how do you make sure of which one you're taking, right? So there's definitely the element of like, what is the common kind of like metric, right? Is it revenue? Is it like ROI? What is it that you are assessing all these projects against? Be it pet projects, right? Be it something from executive. That way you have an idea of like, okay, here are the initiative against what matrix, what is important for the company and what is important for my team, and what's important like just in general, right? And kind of evaluate towards that. So what I'm trying to say is like address it more objectively, so there is no kind of like, oh, you're not taking my project, right? It's more of like, okay, based on these criteria and based on what is important for the company, here is what is stacked rank. And be very, I think what has been really great was like be very transparent with what you're doing. So meaning like, here are the 10 projects that I'm going to fund, all this is under the cut line. There is very clear justification why yours is under the cut line because of XYZ metrics that we're evaluating against. And then make sure your partners are also part of this journey, right? So it could be in some place could be like, hey, my top priority PP0 is any cross-functional high priority, or like anything that's like cross-org stuff that needs to be done. Or in some companies, there is like a top 10 list, right? So you can say this falls on the top 10 list, rank 1 or rank 10 or whatever it is. And then kind of like use just like kind of really objective metrics for you to kind of be able to kind of to evaluate these, and then be transparent. Be transparent what's under your cut list. Be transparent of what's above their ask. And therefore, if there is any negotiation that needs to happen, you can facilitate that. And be open to be willing to facilitate those discussions.
Right. And I totally agree with you in terms of being transparent, because sometimes the program managers could both be a connector or the bottleneck of the person in the middle, right? So if we hold all the information to ourselves, hiding behind spreadsheets or whatever, then even though we don't have bad intention, it's not transparent to people. People feel like something is happening. When people can see it, they feel better. So I actually using that example, because there's a question coming up from the audience as well, saying, hey, when you have a cross team, cross backlog, how do you prioritize? I think one of I'll share a little bit of my perspective, and I would love to hear it from yours as well. Because it is inherently, you have different teams could have different priorities, because every product teams or product areas have their own charter, right? So when you have two teams coming together, and how do you prioritize this team's work versus the team B's work is challenging. So the way, at least that we find out a way to manage it, that is adding, it's a two-step process. Number one step is we agree on a company or bigger level goals on it's going to be drive growth, so drive engagement, so forth. You align on the bigger level goals. So every initiative and product backlog would tie to these goals, number one. And so we define those goals. We also define allocation. So are we going to spend 50% on this growth row or 20% on the retention row, and so on, so on and so forth. So when we come to this cross team dependencies, our contention, what we do is first we look at they are aligned to the goals. If they are same goal, then we can compare them with each other, see who drives more benefits to the goal. And then the other part we're looking at is to cross the goals, then we will figure out how much allocation to these goals already. So if you plan to allocate 30%, you already added 40%. Guess what? This is just cannot happen, right? You have to stay within quote unquote allocation. So that's our experience when you have a different team, different prioritization, different goals. And when you have a cross team, then we use both allocation as well as the prioritization within the same goals to drive that kind of contention. How does it work in your experience?
Yeah, and my experience is also very similar. The framework we use is number one, like, is there, what is the top level goal, right? What's the common, usually companies would have like top common metrics that we're driving towards, or some kind of theme that we're focusing on this quarter, this year. Usually is a year's time span, lesser than, like, not lesser than that, right? Or like here for example, like we're going to focus on SMB, for example, right? And so what are the initiatives, and like across teams, kind of like what are the initiatives that are happening that is contributing to SMB's growth? And then so then from there is like, there's two steps, like what Becky was saying. For us too, from what I've seen too, is that you want to make sure that your roadmap is not basically just everything that everybody has dependencies on you. So you want to have some kind of allocation agreed upon, I think up to like senior executive, which could be like your VP of your area, that, hey, we know that we're a foundational area or we're a platform area, and there's a lot of incoming stuff based on data. We should, our recommendation is we're like 60-40, right? We'll keep 40% for things that are within our organization, and then 60% for anything that are cross dependencies that we need to be involved in. And then any trade-off at that point, it's like, you bring it up, right? Like once you reach beyond 60 and if you still feel like, hey, this team, I think like will really contribute a huge amount for SMB, maybe a little bit more than what I'm doing for the org within myself, that 40% allocation, then that discussion needs to be transparent to the top two, where you're like saying that, okay, I am going to, in this time as an exception, take another 10% to allocate for this. Are you guys okay? This is beyond kind of like the allocations that we agreed upon. And then also make sure the teams also understand from the partner team as well. Hey, we're going above and beyond to kind of make sure that we're addressing this. But please understand that this is an exception, right? Because if not, that's going to be a repeat customer that's coming your way. So
yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. The agreed upon of allocation in some angles that would help drive the conversation in addition to being transparent. So there's a related question about how much authority does the program managers have in telling other teams what we can and cannot do. So I think it's related, but still would love to hear how your experience.
So actually, before we move to that one, I think one quick example in the like framework just in general is like oftentimes, what I've seen is that people's like, oh, I need your team to do something. I think dig it a little deeper around like, can they actually do it themselves? And you just do for example, I'm just going to go a little bit into the tactical side. Can they just do an RB support? right? So they can actually do the coding and your team can just do RV support. Can you coach that team to do something if they're a repeat customer of yours? So just think about like, I would say if it's a repeat customer or a repeat dependency, then think about also like creative ways to not have, to kind of let them be self-sufficient, but you also still seeing things. So just want to kind of want to throw it out there as well. In terms of
No,
program,
actually,
yeah, go ahead, Becky.
yeah. No, I think you're totally right. I forgot about something like you said that. So sometimes when you see dependency always coming from a certain area, that actually drives technical design decisions in terms of building more interfaces and APIs, instead of like always have to come in to change this part of the code. And that's actually a lot of strategic value a savvy program manager can help, especially you have a historic data to show, okay, this team always coming to us, they have these challenges, and you would want to figure out how can we make that, instead of a dependency all the time, we make it an API. So the engineering team can say, hey, in the future, you should call it API, we make this component, we do a one-time investment, that would be better. So I think that's something, actually happened many, many times in my career, to dependency turning to changing a tech design to be more scalable, dependent, service oriented, and so forth.
Yeah, and specifically, I think like as the company grows, as your team grows, sometimes you do need to figure out, do I need to become a platform, right? At some point. So, in LinkedIn, for example, like, LinkedIn.com, the front page, a lot of different teams are actually coming to work there on that single page. And there's like different teams across the company, right? So how do we make sure that we can help to make that time to market faster without us always changing our code, right? So I think the second one around like how much authority does a program manager have? So I would say it really depends on the company. I think company and also team. I would say like, I won't say what we can or cannot do. So I think maybe if you wanna, I don't know if you wanna give an example around it a little bit more. So it really depends. Like for program managers, I would say like in the absence of, what I've seen is like in the absence of, for technical program managers, in the absence of product or engineering, like you're there to bring those insights as well. You can help make decisions and you can also help direct, because you know the context, you know the vision, you know where the team is going. And also that's why I say it's kind of dependent, is because what is the dynamics within the organization and the team that you're in. So there isn't a hard line of like, this is what we can tell, or a team to do versus not. In terms of timeline in general, you own the timeline, right? You are the owner towards it. So if something is at risk, then you have the authority to kind of tell people like, hey, we are at risk, how can we collaboratively deal with this? And in some cases you need to be more assertive, where it's like, what can we do to help you unblock this? Can we escalate together on this?
Right. I totally agree with you. And I want to kind of switch gear, go back to the allocation a little bit more, because I think it tied to something about pre-planning as well. So one of the challenging thing for program manager, and actually in quarterly planning in general, is the cross-team decision-making, because it's easier relatively as individual product managers make a decision on his or her own product backlog. It is harder when you go across multiple teams, because everyone has a different perspective, different focus. So using the example of a LinkedIn homepage, you have a different team come to you, and it will always be the case, regardless of however you change the architecture and design and everything. So how do you think about allocation? What is the typical baseline you going about it, and how it applied during the planning process? Would love to hear your perspective, or share a little bit of how I go about that as well.
Yeah, so I think like in terms of just resources in general, like how we allocate resources depending on like the different teams that come in, I think again comes to the point of like, what is the common goal? And the way we have, I think depending on which company, it kind of acts a little bit differently. In some cases where we have a lot of people coming to a single team, sometimes we have this process where we say the onboarding process. So basically you come in, and this is part of the pre-planning as well, where you're kind of pitching to the team, to the platform team, like, here's what we want to do. What do you think? And then and you have that live discussion of like, Does it align with the principles? Like what is the principle of this product, right? Does it align with kind of where we want to bring the journey? For example, like we want to build communities, right? Or what is the main goal?
Right.
And it's more like a brainstorming. So the onboarding session, typically we have engineering, product design, and TPM in there, and mainly to just have an open discussion. So the sooner you kind of pre-socialize the idea, right? It may
Right.
not be, it could be like, hey, I want to add a GPS somewhere, right? Because I want to show people where the office is, for example. And the question may be, is it even feasible, right? What is the cost for it, like at a high level? Is it an XL?
Right.
Is it an XXL, right? And then from there, then it's like quarter by quarter, kind of like seeing like what can fit. And that's how we allocate kind of like timeline. Like what metrics is it going to contribute to? And then also over what timeline, how much effort is it worth for us to do it? Is there an ROI, right?
Right.
And I think the other thing is like, is it reusable? Is it something that you're bringing an idea where we can actually, there are other customers that are interested in this, right? Can we build it where it's a scalable thing? So
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like a both a product discovery and then a prioritization and an allocation all happen at the same time. I will just kind of componentize in three things so that they probably will help people maybe not as familiar with this process. First of all, product managers should continuously they should have their own product ideas and backlogs and feedback and concept all the time. It's not just happening during the quarterly planning. That has to be there all the time. Product should think about what they wanted to do, talk to their stakeholders. That's the one part of the pre-planning and or allocation, because these other things matter to the product. But then once as a product thinking about their product ideas, they would have implications that impact the other areas. And that's the second part, which is the conversation between product engineering, maybe with the other areas of product engineering coming together to see what's the implication when the two things coming together. Maybe you want to do something, the other team want to do something else. They don't even will become a cohesive product. So that feasibility across multiple teams also happen continuously, so that these two things, when they come along, they will say, okay, when I have a set of things that I really want to do, let's say quarter or 2 quarters now, they are technically user experience and business perspective are already kind of aligned that can be done. So then become a prioritization, which really is around timing. Can we do it this quarter or next quarter? So the timing itself become limited by the resources and the time we have at a given quarter. And in this case, then we have to decide, how do we decide across multiple teams what we can do in this quarter? And that allocation will come into play. We'll say we can allocate, let's say, 3 goals, and each area we're going to allocate 30%. I just using the example, a third of the resource go to each of the goals. So whatever your initiative or product fit into those goals, the allocation needs to overall across all product areas to fit like that. Then you have another allocation, which is by area, like Pam, you mentioned earlier. So let's say if you're a team that people coming to you asking for work all the time, you will have agreed upon allocation to say, let's say, the team A, team B, and my team, we will say, hey, team A and team B, collectively, you guys can have 60% of my resources, and the remaining 40% resources is going to be ours, because we also need to build our product. So then, so you have allocation. One is based on the goals, so you can compare things all in the same goal for the multiple teams come in, and across teams, there are different allocation. So you look at a different perspective. So with this tool will help you to decide what can or cannot fit in this quarter. It become a very transparent prioritization discussion based on the data, based on agreed upon alignment, based on agreed upon the allocation. So that's the pre-planning. If you think about it, it's the 3 steps, right? Product continues to manage their own backlog, and the product work with the other areas. There are dependencies and technical alignment, the cohesiveness, and then finally, it will be the actual quarterly planning that would say, what can we fit next quarter?
Yeah, and I would say like for pre-planning, it really depends, right? So that's why like some of the definition may not be very clear cut. So like pre-planning, for example, what I've seen in the past too is like, if you know there is a team that you're always going to be dependent on. So for example, like we know we have a dependency on trust, or trust has a dependency on our team, like the UI team all the time, then you want to kind of build a roadmap together. And so this is where like you are like planning together, and you want to do that pre-planning where it's like, okay, let's align both of our resources together in the roadmap, right? Because we know that there is always going to be some regulation down the road. Do we have insights on that so that we can pre-plan and it's not a surprise? So pre-planning really helps with like when you get into the actual quarterly planning, even like meeting, you shouldn't be surprised with anything that anybody says. So that's the real goal of pre-planning. Like you should be aware of what's happening. You should have an open channel. And that's what we talk about, like the onboarding. It could be like office hours. It could be like a variety of things. As you get bigger and bigger, you see people having like office hours and onboarding. In a smaller setting, you can just go to your, well, now you can turn around to another cubicle, but like you can ask somebody and reach out to like partners that you're familiar with. It's like, is there something coming? Should I be aware of something? Or I am building this. Should I care about something that maybe I don't know? Like, can you tell me, right? So all of that negotiation, like both product and program managers have a responsibility in that, I feel. So, you know, product manager can't do everything, one human as well, right? So program manager sometimes leans in to do that as well. And then actually,
and also,
go ahead. Oh, I was gonna say, like, just to address somebody's question around what allocation means, like for us, allocation in the context of software is literally engineering or design. So don't forget about design. Design also needs resources to kind of allocate. Yeah,
resources basically. And to your point, I also want to double click that, you know, obviously in the past you do that all on meetings, and more people moving this towards tools, right? So if you have a source of truth and then keep track on things, you know, every product manager has managed their own backlog and whatnot. And then if you have dependencies, you call out the other team so the other team can see it. So you can actually manage these workflows inside the tools. And if you have a tool, so you can manage your product workflow in terms of backlog of product. You can highlight dependency in the other areas. The other area can see things coming to them. So you can conduct all this, you know, quote unquote pre-planning, at least track these things on the tool so that it will not, again, not when you have a tool, a source of truth became a more transparent to everyone. There's nobody hiding things, right? Whenever you have meetings, have hobby conversations, it became a inner information opaqueness, right? Only the people in the room know that. And even if you send updates, send your recaps and stuff, you know, 99.9% of the context is lost because it wasn't really conversational in that way. So I just want to highlight that, you know, keep in mind when you, for a more effective working as a team, especially when you have lots of cross-functional teams and lots of changes, lots of moving pieces, use it to invest in a tool. It make your life better. And then also, and I personally believe it's just your responsibility to have things, information available to everyone versus, you know, hiding behind one or two people, other people don't have it, that create a more opaqueness and then a fear of politics being played.
Actually, if we can go into the Q&A real quick, like somebody was asking, I think this is related to how much authority does program managers have in telling teams what to do? I think one of the example is like, can we take on projects, like the data of like, we can take on X amount of projects, or like what bandwidth it is to accomplish Y number of projects. Program managers, because we own the roadmap, plus we also see the resourcing, right? We do have the ability to kind of show what the cut line is. And that's very much within the responsibility of a program manager to kind of say, here are all the incoming stuff, we've gathered the data, here's what it looks like. I mean, of course, validate towards like your product and engineering managers, like here's the cut line. Sometimes, I think as a best practice that I've seen mostly in companies is we use a lot of data, right? So for example, we say, you know, within a quarter is X amount of working weeks. Now, make sure you include kind of like if there are holidays, if there's company holidays, right? If there's shutdowns and things like that, plus actual like public holidays, and then count number of weeks, you know, how many sprints basically in that specific quarter. And then using those numbers, you can say like, how many resources do I have? One resources is productive for X amount of hours, you know, and then you can kind of like see all of that. Now, you can do this in a tool like what Becky says, or you can do it simply in a spreadsheet, right? Just make sure you have something consistent so that quarter over quarter, like the baseline is not changing.
And also make sure you have this information to others. I think more and more we start to see that, you know, in the past, if I were to go back in time, in a waterfall era, nobody touched project plan. Project manager is the only one touches everything, which is great to have lots of authorities and control. But the reality is we don't really have authority and control. So more and more companies become even more decentralized, and they have people update things themselves. And because they're working on things anyway, instead of having go through a program manager to become a sort of the keyboard person. So that making the resource information available to the right participants is actually very important. Again, that make it a transparent organization helps making decisions better. So I have seen, for example, companies I'm working with these days and companies I used to work even at the PayPal times is that we make a lot of those resource information more available than before. In the past, people trying to hide it, try to quote unquote protect their roadmap, actually is bad for the company. Make it available where people understand where does the resource go, why certain things get it done. Because when people see it, say, okay, I know the things that I care about a lot, but I can see all the other stuff they are more important and they are more urgent. So then no longer have sort of like the bad feeling about that.
Yep. It also helps people to understand, especially with data, like really helping people understand why are we only committing to X amount, right? Because in some quarters like Christmas, like Q4, typically it's a very short quarter. People don't realize that. Like you have Thanksgiving, you have Christmas, and you have to account people going on DT, like PTO, ZTO, or like time off, right? Just in general.
Exactly.
So being able to justify like, hey, we can only take half of what we typically take because we, number one, need to be ready for the systems for the holidays, right? Depending on the type of business that you have. And so that therefore we can only take X amount. Used to be some companies, whole of Q4, you don't do any new features, right? You're just making sure your system is stable and everything. And so you want to have that data. And when I say like baseline, it's like you really want to be able to explain how the math works, right?
Right.
And therefore you also become more credible around like the information that you're providing and the what you can do or what you cannot do kind of thing.
Right, exactly. You're not going to be treated as a person protect my team, but more of saying doing the right thing for the company. So I have one last question. We know we're coming up quick on time. Just one quick question is about small companies, how you're going to go about doing the pre-planning and whatnot. I just want to highlight a bit because I went from companies to PayPal 15,000 all the way down to companies less than 100 people. So I want to share how that worked for the smaller companies. Number one, you don't think about your quarterly plan as something happen once a quarter. What that really is a quarterly outlook. You look at a quarter at a time, just like you look at your sprints 2 weeks at a time. You have a quarter, but you continuously think about your roadmap from a product perspective, and also even with the program manager, so that your product thoughts and then the cross-team dependencies are being looked at along the way, especially if you have a tool, keep track of them there. So it's there always. It's a matter of very quick exercise on how things can come through. So working with your product counterpart, make sure that the product focus and the high level understanding, estimates and whatnot, if you have them available, it can continue to carry on, right? It's just product changing the prioritization. So that's we're kind of coming up on time. I'm gonna just turn the mic over to Baji and to wrap up. Hopefully we can have additional resources you can reach us to.
Absolutely, and thank you both so much. I love how the majority of that actually turned into audience-led questions. So it's great to see people have very specific questions that they're coming into this with, and they're looking to you to provide answers. So thanks again. I will be sending the recording. We also write up a blog post with just key notes and key takeaways. We send a few resources after the fact. So we've had specific questions come in around templates and plans and wikis and how specifically you've built that out. One additional resource that Dragonboat is offering is that for the rest of the month, we are offering to take your existing spreadsheets and the kind of work that you've done to create planning and map that all over to the Dragonboat infrastructure so that you can see how that would look in a tool, and you can see the different hierarchies, you can see how it would be automated and synced back and forth between Jira. So we'll reach out with more information on that as well. And we hope we can help some of the people on this call who haven't yet started quarterly planning or who are hoping to really kind of automate and streamline the process. get to the next stage. So thank you both, Pam and Becky. That was incredibly insightful. And thanks to everyone for joining. We hope to keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And really thank you, Pam, for hosting this again. And, you know, she's at LinkedIn. You guys can also reach out to her on LinkedIn. We're having a program manager Facebook group as well, so that again, additional resources for anyone who's you know, have questions running to this. We'll help each other. We're in this together.
I love it. All right.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.